Our scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4. Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and his reputation spread throughout the region. He was teaching in the Galilean synagogues, and all were loud in their praise. Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. Entering the synagogue on the Sabbath, as was his habit, Jesus stood up to do the reading. When the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, he unrolled the scroll and found the passage where it was written, "The Spirit of our God is upon me, because the Most High has anointed me to bring good news to those who are poor. God has sent me to proclaim liberty to those who are captive, recovery of sight to those who are blind, and release to those in prison, to proclaim the year of God's favor." Rolling up the scroll, Jesus gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he said to them, "Today, in your hearing, this scripture passage is fulfilled." Ancient words from our tradition for our present day consideration.
Well, we're in a sermon series right now that looks at traditions within Judaism that were kind of tests for sanity. The first week we looked at the symbol of the divine name and how the symbol of God is more like a verb than it is a noun, and it's more an experience that we have than a dogma that we believe or disbelieve in. Look at the Shema, which is a call to love with all of our heart, mind, and strength, which means religion cannot tell you what to think. It cannot tell you how to feel or tell you what to do. Instead, it's a call to this full response to life. Today, we're looking at another passage that the church just kind of forgot, or more likely ignored. And that's the teaching of Jubilee. The reason we're doing this week is because not long ago, there was a very nice couple who decided not to come to St. Andrews anymore because they felt that when they came, that they were hearing my views on politics. And I think that's a very fair question to ask, as long as you're asking it both ways. Am I bringing like modern, I won't even say liberal because I'm way to the left of that. But am I projecting that onto the text, or has the church ignored a central calling of people who say they're following Jesus? Today, I would like for all of us to honestly ask that question. Are there political implications to what Jesus taught? Or do we live in two different worlds? You can pray for the poor, but you're not supposed to work for them. That you pray for your human family in other parts of the world, but it's not Christian to actually ever do anything in the real world. That you're supposed to give all of that to God. That while our nation is, while our world is being poisoned and making human survival less and less likely, is that God's business to turn around, or is it our business to live a different way? Obviously, I have a bias here, which I own up to. But I really want to look at it and ask you the question to answer honestly. What does your conscience say about the political implications of love? Every time they do a poll on Christianity, the church is dying nationally. Now, I don't know if that's where it's going to go, But I wonder if that would be the case if we actually did what Jesus had asked us to do. I think the symbol of Christianity in our day is Donald Trump holding up a Bible upside down, calling us to a Christianity that violates everything Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not asking you to agree with me or to disagree with me, but to come from the place of conscience. What are the implications of saying we are followers of Jesus? We're going to look at a passage. Do you remember when Jesus is about to be born and Mary sings a song? This baby's going to shake things up. The powerful will be lowered. The weak will be lifted up. Do you remember that? So why don't we preach that? Why do we act like Jesus came and said, I want you to recite the Apostles' Creed every week? Why didn't he say that? If that's what Christianity is, why does the Sermon on the Mount talk about ethics? I would suggest that the church made a political decision a long time ago to affirm the status quo, whatever that is, and call it non-political. But there is no place non-political. Politics is how we're treating other people. And when the church is silent about oppression, then who speaks for the weak? Who speaks for the oppressed? Remember that Jesus lived in an occupied territory. And so he wasn't at liberty to say things directly. So he spoke in a way that the Romans would hear one message and the Jewish people would hear something else. We're going to look at the Jubilee texts which Jewish children were taught all along, of a hope for the world. Now, it seems a kind of pie in the sky kind of thing. Someday the poor will be released from their poverty. Someday the captives will be set free. Someday there'll be land enough for all of us. And that day will be called the Day of God, the Day of Jubilee. So while he's surrounded by Roman occupiers, he gets up and says, I've come to preach good news to the poor. Now, what are they going to hear? I've come to preach release for captives. I've come to declare the Day of Jubilee is here and now. I believe what it means to follow Jesus is to hear that call from your heart, from your conscience, from the essence of your being, and honestly and courageously answer, what does love call us to do in the world? So we're going to look at some passages, and can we go to the first one? Now, the only reason I have the courage to preach these kinds of things is because I know that if you disagree, you'll feel free to do that. If I thought you were going to mindlessly follow what I say, I would have retired a long time ago. I want to preach as honestly as I can from my heart and trust you to ask, does this really work in my life and in my world? Let's look at this. Remember, the first thing we looked at was the divine name. That's the 4 letters that you see there. It's a mysterious presence. I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Remember the story, they were enslaved? Now, when Moses went to the Pharaoh, was that apolitical? When he said, let my people go, was that just a spiritual kind of wish? Or was he trying to make it on earth the way it is in heaven, or the way that he thought God would want things to be? Not that he believed in heaven, that's a later development, but I brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan, which is a problem too, obviously, and to be your God. If any of your neighbors are reduced to such poverty that they sell themselves to you, You must not treat them as bonded workers. Their status is to be that of hired hands and resident laborers with you, and will be subject to you only until the Jubilee year. They may then leave your service with their children and return to their own ancestral property. In other words, even people who had kind of sold themselves and now lived in desperate poverty and sold themselves to you, on the day of Jubilee, they would be set free from all those obligations. If you had heard the call of Jubilee and you heard Jesus as a young man beginning his ministry, his first sermon, by saying, I've come to preach good news to the poor, don't you think that should have a little weight? He starts his ministry by saying, I've come to preach good news to the poor, release the captives, and to declare the day of Jubilee. So the day of God. How can we take Jubilee out of the tradition if we believe that Jesus is referring to that, of a new vision of humankind? When you go back and look at the teachings of Jesus, again, I'm not talking about the Apostles' Creed. Europe came up with that, and Apostles' Creed is fine. It's kind of a cosmic poetry. It's beautiful. But Jesus didn't mention it. Jesus didn't sign off on it. We have to keep reminding each other, Jesus never saw the Christian writings. He never saw the organized church and said, yep, you got my vote. We don't know what Jesus would say about that, but we do know what he said about our human family. One of the things I think the Presbyterians have right when we do the disciples' prayer, instead of saying, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, we translate the original Greek, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now, what if Jesus really meant that? That this new realm that he's calling heaven, and he's trying to teach it with parables. Now, you teach things in parables because you're trying to help people see things that are right in front of them, but they can't. So heaven isn't an apolitical place after we die. It's the workings of the sacred where we are, in whatever place that is. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. How the world would be different, so different, if we didn't spiritualize Jesus' teachings. And said he's really talking about setting us free from the things that entrap us. What does this call to freedom mean in a country that has a higher percentage of its people in prison than any other land on earth? At least that was true up until a couple of months ago. Somebody else may have caught up to us by now. We're not the only thugs on the planet. But what does it mean to call ourselves land of the free and then enslave a larger portion of our population than the lands we call dictatorships? What does that mean? What is it that we're not looking at and seeing because we don't want to see it? What is the purpose of prisons really? I think to follow Jesus means for our lives to be good news for the poor and be words of liberation to those who are enslaved. If that's not what it means to follow Jesus, then I don't know. I don't know what it does. Now, the second verse of the Jubilee text, these are Leviticus 25. In this year of Jubilee, you are to return to your ancestral land. If you sell or buy land among yourselves, neither of you may use the calculation of the Jubilee year to cheat one another. You must not sell land in perpetuity. You understand what that's saying? You can't sell land permanently. Could you have a capitalist economy if you took that seriously? This isn't me. Punching my tires isn't going to change. I'm asking you to come from your conscience. Could you have a system that allows economic exploitation, allows a handful of people to own everything, and have children who are born as renters, born as employees, born as exploited laborers, if we took this seriously? You must not sell land in perpetuity, for the land belongs to me. That's God talking. And you are only foreigners and tenants. Throughout all the land that you hold, you will allow the right of redemption, that you can buy yourself out of poverty. If any of you are reduced to poverty and sell off some of your property, your next of kin who holds the duty of redemption must come and redeem what the relatives sold. So when Jesus is called the Redeemer, do you think that's just theological? Or is there something more immediate that matters more to the life you're going to be living this week? Have you ever heard the indigenous saying, the land does not belong to us, we belong to the land? Or the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth? That's Jubilee. That's Sanity 101. Because the earth is an ecological whole. And when we cut it up like jigsaw puzzles and say people born to wealth can buy enough to rob everyone else, that's not this message of freedom. Capitalism is based on property rights. It's not evil, but it bases its value calculations on property rights, not human rights, which means those without property have no rights. Think about that. And the church says, well, we'll give you charity, but we're not going to give you justice. Is that what Jesus is talking about here? If we base our economic system on property rights at a time when most of the property has been bought up, then what happens to the new kids on the block? They're born on the outside of the story. So what Jubilee is saying is every so often, it was every 50 years, they were supposed to divide things back up again. It was only Jewish people. It was, there are lots of caveats here. But if Jesus is opening a door for all people, as I believe he is, that's saying that every economic system has to see itself as secondary to human rights, and even more importantly, to ecological sustainability. Because the earth doesn't belong to us. We are stewards of the earth. And if we forget that, we poison ourselves. So even though you don't hear this often in Sunday schools around the country, you certainly don't hear this in Christian nationalism. Humankind is your family. One human family. And the earth is to be shared with all of us, but it belongs to no one of us. That's the second step of sanity that we call Jubilee. Now, the last idea Oh, y'all already hit me, okay. I titled that, and you can decide whether I'm, again, a commie creep, which again is separate to whether that's true or not. Yes, I'm a commie creep, but communism is not the only form of socialism. You don't even have to call it socialism. But can we figure out an economic system that's based on the common good and not what enriches a small handful of people? Now, people have been warning me for 30 years not to talk about capitalism. It hasn't worked. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. It will never work because capitalism, there's some good things we can take from it. But it's like the nation state. Humankind has outgrown it. And you can see this in the Middle East. There's no way out. Sectarian religion, capitalism, and the nation state are some of the worst problems the world has now. Jubilee is calling us out of that limited worldview. And I'll go ahead and get back to the text. If Israelites, who are your relatives, become impoverished so that they cannot support themselves in the community, they must be given assistance as if they were aliens or strangers. Now that's a little bit ironic because the covenant made with God was based on not mistreating immigrants, migrants, and sojourners. The American church has used the holy whiteout to remove the covenant with God is dependent on us not taking advantage of those who wander the earth. He says, you were oppressed in Egypt, and the covenant I'm making with you is contingent on you not doing that to somebody else. You must not charge interest on a loan. Could you have capitalism? Now again, we don't want to take any scripture literally. So we can play with these things and tweak them. But what direction does religion call us to? Property rights or human rights? What does this sound like? You must not charge interest on a loan, either by demanding it in advance or otherwise by adding it to the principal. Revere God and let your neighbor live with you. Do not charge interest when advancing money or profit from food advanced on credit. How different the world would be if the church had eyes to see and ears to hear. How different the Christian church would be. We wouldn't side with bullies against the oppressed. We wouldn't be sitting at the king's court. You ever seen a chessboard? See the bishop right there sold out, right next to the king and queen? That's not the place for the followers of Jesus. When you see the cross, that's not a call to put gay people on the cross. That's the wrong side of the cross. You are called to risk your well-being for others. Not foolishly, not to throw your life away, but to realize that love has to suffer for those it loves, for the beloved. However radical you see me, I'm a punk compared to Jesus. When you look at the early church, I'm not the one who said you have to choose between loving God and money. Right? That wasn't me. I didn't write that. That's in the book. When it says, money is the root of all evil, the love of money is the root of all evil. I didn't come up with that. Why doesn't the church take that seriously? How can we expect the world to respond when we betray the message? The gospel is not what's found in the Apostles' Creed. The gospel is what's found in the Sermon on the Mount. I have nothing against the Apostles' Creed, but the reason Christianity has not saved the world is because we jettisoned the heart of the message. Revere God and let your neighbor live with you. Do not charge interest when advancing money or profit from food advanced on credit. We have to deconstruct the economic systems that impoverish people. Charity is not enough. Charity is not enough. I love that we do charity. But this is calling us to a step beyond that, to a world where you don't need charity because people are born with justice. Food, clothing, housing, meaningful work are assumed as universal human rights. Well, thank you for your patience with this. I think it's a serious question. Am I projecting liberal or leftist values on the text? Or when you look at the text, did the church sell out a long time ago? And do we need to go a different direction? Do we need a radical reformation? If so, then following Jesus means that you and I make our lives good news for the poor and liberation for those who are incarcerated, which means no more talk of law and order from the church. Our founder was a criminal, according to the system. We follow an executed rebel. So we have to be good news for the poor. We have to realize that the earth does not belong to anyone. We have to go through a spiritual reformation to understand that. The earth belongs to all of us and to all the species. It belongs to God, according to the text. So we have to put all our ambitions and our economic decisions within that context. And then finally, we can't build structures that enrich us by impoverishing others. When Jesus spoke, he was a young man. He begins his ministry. Probably the worst political move of all time, right? I've come to preach good news to the poor. Who wants to hear that? I've come to speak of liberation for those who are captive. And to say that Jubilee is not only real, it's not only the hope of humankind for dignity, but it's also started right here and right now. Well, I invite you now to a moment, your own reflection on these words.